All right, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully we're back. Logos Media's Unspun episode number, what is this? 214? Should be, although it looks like it might be showing the wrong number on the thing there. Hopefully not. Let's see. Is it going? My goodness, it didn't refresh on me. There it goes. It's going. All right. We are live. So this is Logos Media's Unspun episode number 214, Understanding Heresy, part 3 with Steve Jones. Steve, welcome back.
Hi.
And this is season 14, episode 10. We're going to be wrapping up what we didn't finish last week on Heresy, obviously, and maybe going off into some unrelated stuff afterward. I don't know. What do you think, Steve?
Well, we've sort of made a pact here that at some point in the future, we're going to reverse roles. So you're more experienced at interviewing people. So I was hoping to kind of bridge that gap a little bit towards the end of this and see if we can reverse roles a little bit.
Well, were we planning on doing that in a separate episode? And
yeah.
Okay, because
I'm just trying to build in a little experience for me.
Got it. What we're talking about doing, folks, is have Steve or someone, possibly Chris, anybody who is up for it, but Steve apparently wants to learn the skills, to interview me on my new article, or what's basically turned into a book at this point. I'm looking at it. Flesh of the Gods, Teonanacatl and the Aztec Mushroom Death Cult, how a mushroom death cult was transformed into a new age religion. And I've been pounding away at the keyboard for weeks on it, and it's now at 70 pages single space, 68 pages single space. So it's gotten pretty big and pretty dark, and covered a lot of stuff. And you're reading it, Steve, sent you on a bells and whistles hunt, discovering other stuff that kind of ties things together.
Well, not only that, but I think there's an intersection point between what we're both doing. When I got sort of first interested in researching, this was like over 20 years ago, starting with Vatican II, it was obvious that something had happened to Christianity that can't be explained by what they're telling everybody. And so as I researched Vatican II, you found out that there, during the 40s, late 40s, early 50s, that a basic, I don't know, call it a con job or something was on, that nobody's really admitting the full spectrum of what was going on. And I think where we're intersecting is you found the similar thing with Christianity also, but also leading into the drug paraphernalia and all that stuff in the 60s, the drug culture, that a similar kind of false story was told. And it seems like we've noticed a lot of times the players seem to be connected. The players are similar.
or not just similar, but often the same, or
very same guy,
buddies, or whatever. But
yeah, so this wasn't planned out this way or anything like that. It's just, I would bring up something to you and you bring up something to me, and voila, the paths are crossing.
Well, and what kicked me off to get this Teonanacatl article finished was my cousin, and she needed some information on it, and she was asking me questions about it. And so I sent her my paper, and, a few times a year I had pulled it up and worked on it a bit, but I hadn't just dedicated several weeks into getting it done. But, she started asking me questions about the mushrooms. I'm just like, look, stay away. It's not what most people believe. I used to think that kind of stuff. And, it originated out of a death cult. And then when we look at, and you and I have talked about this, when we look at movies like The Wicker Man, especially the original one. And then we look at Burning Man, and then we look at the whole drug culture there and the human sacrifice going on in both of those. It's, it's pretty clear that they are pushing us in that direction.
For me, I think the intersection point was when I started researching Vatican II and what had really happened. One of the underneath thing that doesn't seem to get mentioned at all is to the degree that they leveraged the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, most people, even Christians, oddly enough, as I've done a little of my own surveys, a lot of them don't even know what the Dead Sea Scrolls were anymore and why they're important. Some people seem to know a little bit, but hardly anybody remembers the impact of it all. But I think where we intersected on that is you had connections with John Allegro, and John Allegro was somebody who I had researched, and talking about that, his whole spin was similar to what the general spin of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that this somehow vindicated an early form of Christian Gnosticism, which eventually he insisted spilled over to mushrooms, which that led to your mushroom research. And
I'm still the publisher of his book, and I try to disclose that everywhere when possible, because I was fully down that rabbit hole 10 years ago, and over the years it's like, wow, there is something seriously wrong with this whole narrative. But unlike Wasson, Wasson, in my second book, The Holy Mushroom, I exposed how Wasson was who launched all of the attacks on Allegro, and went through and investigated all of those attacks and showed how it was all Wasson. But that led me really into continuing to investigate Wasson for the last 15, 16 years now, and amassing all of this documentation. And I started writing this Teonanacatl article like 7 years ago, so it was time to get it done. And thanks to Matthew and Ka Painter for the support in the chat. But I just started amassing the original colonial citations that Wasson used, and he fudged most of them. Most of them were about cannibalism, human sacrifice, murder, whatever, and he just omits all of that and takes a little line about mushrooms and goes that direction. So, and that's exactly what he did with Allegro, going back to Allegro's Sacred Mushroom and the Cross and whatnot. But today, go ahead.
Well, what I'm proposing is for tonight is to take that intersection point. And I know I've explained this a little bit before, but to me, you can't bury the lead, or you can't bury the main evidence and be telling the truth. So my intention wasn't necessarily to pick on the Catholic Church or the Jews or anything like that, but simply in charity, that you really don't have a proper decipherment or a proper conclusion to a problem unless you tell all the truth. And to me, when I think, as in your thing, is that they buried the lead. They buried the fact that a lot of these mushroom cults, as portrayed by the different CIA agents and things that led to MK Ultra and stuff, buried the fact that a lot of these cults were cannibal cults. There's a similarity in the Dead Sea Scroll thing, is as it went to this discussion, they buried the point that the critical issue was what was called the Jewish blood libel, and whether there was any truth to it and whether it led up to stuff. And I think all these things, there's a truth to it, there is an over exaggeration to it, and hopefully we can suss that all out. But you can't suss it all out if it's prohibited territory and you can't discuss it.
Right. And, I'm sure we'll find out. And eventually maybe you and I should join heads and work on collaborate on a book about all of this, because everything is coming together. And, what appears to me, and you and I have talked about this, and you said that you agreed, was that it appears that Christ was supposed to be the last human sacrifice, ending these old religions and the cannibalism and human sacrifice, etc., and bringing about logos as God instead of, executing thousands of people on the sunstone or whatever the case may be in these cults. So hold on, I gotta mute my phone here. So there's an overlap there too between Christianity and you're supposed to drink the wine and take the bread in remembrance of Christ rather than actually imbibing and chowing down on somebody's leg.
And well, the thing is too, is that I think as you're discovering on your end, there's a lot of forensic evidence, even in the Bible itself, that unless you really understand what's going on, there's a broader story going underneath that's kind of buried that scholars do know about, but I think they're afraid to bring it up because of the volatility of it. And again, the idea here is not to incriminate one culture or something like that. It's to bring these things in light so a rational solution can be found. Right now, I mean, you look at last night, the main news was the leaking of the Supreme Court documents having to do with Roe versus Wade. And you listen to the news today, all these same issues are still coming up. Christians are still being blamed for something they didn't do. Jews are being blamed for something that's misunderstood, all that stuff. You can't expect to come to a decent solution if you're not really telling the whole truth.
Right. It's just like with the the book of Esther and the blood libel and all of that, and the book of Esther being what seems clearly the fifth gospel. And if they don't want to talk about that and only talk about Christian wrongs, then that's not an honest dialogue.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not like I'm inventing something when I say that either. When you say something like that, you have to look at Esther's referencing, having buried into it a reference to Christianity and the crucifixion. That's not something I'm making up or anything like that. Going all the way back to the beginning of anthropology with James George Fraser, he knew it. It's in other books. It's just one of these volatile things that gets buried. And if Vatican II was honest about their sincerity in solving these things, you can't just bury these things. And one of the discussions that had come to me is looking at Vatican II is the chief rabbi at Rome. During Vatican II, his son was a guy by the name of Ariel Toff, and he wrote a book called Blood Sacrifice. I can't remember exactly the name of it, but his protest was that, again, they weren't being honest, and they're putting all the blame on Christianity, and he felt at some point that was going to haunt the whole solution, that in order to get a just solution, everybody's got to lay their cards on the table and say, this is what we did.
Yeah. Own it.
And it never happened. You got to own it. So anyhow, what I would propose tonight is that we revisit Esther and go back to the evidence of that, bring it forward into Vatican II, where you get the Dead Sea Scrolls and you get John Allegro switching stories in a sense and converting Christianity to a mushroom cult. And then I think that will set us up for turning things the other way around. And maybe towards the end of the show tonight, or maybe the next episode, or whenever you're ready, that we would switch hats. And
all right, are we going to cover the last points we didn't cover in part 2 of this series?
Sure. Why don't you start there, and I'll.
All right, and so did we cover the Gnostics? I know we did some, but
we're always covering the Gnostic. What we didn't. I've covered it in the past with Pseudo-Dionysius,
right,
and the Bacchae, and why that has a relation to Christianity, and why this is all. And we might have to go. Maybe that's a good place to start.
All right, let's go there. Pseudo-Dionysius.
So Dionysius was a god. Really, the legend starts out in Persia, where you have the wine god, and you have. And we've talked about this a little off camera. The Haoma, which was the ritual ingredient, which sort of is a mystery, that the Persians used their sacrifice over. But what happened is the Persians, one of the things is they had a sacred vessel called a rhyton, I believe it was Rhyton, and it was based on the configuration of a ram's or not a ram, but a bull's horn. Most of them are made out of metal, but you can imagine early on, they probably use an actual horn. But the thing is everybody's trying to figure out what really was this sacrificial drink. And one of the things that pops up is ephedra, which now we get into epinephrine, which is another version of adrenaline or something like that. And there's several Bible references. I think you checked it last week or so on wormwood, as the wormwood and the gall. You have Christ on the cross being offered vinegar and gall. And there's several references to that. This probably has a reference to absinthe, which would have been made out of the wormwood and was distilled probably through these Rhyton things. What happened is usually you filled some of these, you look at absinthe, the paraphernalia, usually it comes down to taking the absinthe ingredient and pouring it through ice, and on the bottom you get something that turns a mystical green and goes through this transformation. So in the Bible itself, the other thing that has to do with the Persian wine banquet is the idea of the toast, and that you take wine and you toast it. It's metaphorically the blood of your enemies. So when you make a toast, and the interesting thing about this is the book of Esther is always predicated on the idea that the prophecy of Christ, which led to the 70 weeks, began with a wedding feast. And it's commonly acknowledged that if this was a real event, that it started probably with the wedding feast of Esther. So Esther is tied from even whether the event was a first century event made up or something that was 450 years old by the time of Christ. It's the feast of Esther is deeply, and that timing of the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel to when the Star of Bethlehem would show up. And the crucifixion even is embedded deeply within this idea of a sort of Eucharist of some sort, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So now you go forward, and the big question, I'm not any secret about this, but I'm an Episcopalian, but I was trained pretty heavily by the Orthodox. The Orthodox, one of their big contentions is that we have a feast called Maundy Thursday, which is the night before Good Friday. And it's always called the Last Supper. And it's usually considered the institution of communion, but you would think they would call it the First Supper then, not the Last Supper. So the contention is why there had been a hidden feast along the way here that ended on that night and somehow became something new after that night. What's embedded in all this is the idea of Dionysius the god, which is the god of wine, which I think illustrates what this religion was that was supposed to be replaced in a general. Christianity was a specific religion, but through the Euripides play, the Bacchae, there's a lot of touchstone points within John's gospel, even going into the 11th century, where the Good Friday play, if you go to a more Catholic style or Lutheran style church, or a lot of the higher churches will have a play on Good Friday where the people would act the roles of the various participants in the crucifixion of Christ. Where the precedent was for that, and it's even admitted to in a lot of these documents, was the Bacchae. So you can't really disassociate what's going on in Christianity once you realize that the language that's being used here, the metaphors that are being used, is the Dionysian supper that goes back to the Persian Empire, that goes back to what's being illustrated in the Bacchae and the god Pseudo or Dionysius, which eventually becomes Pseudo Dionysius. Okay, does that make sense? Have I dumped too much on you?
No. So that would make it the Last Supper, not the First Supper.
Well, that's the question. What was the Last Supper, or what was really going on? And I don't know that I have a good answer for that. It's all part of speculation. We can all speculate on that. I have my own beliefs, which oddly enough, I think are evolving the more we research this.
Right.
But what the Bacchae is the king, I believe his name was Pentheus, was a younger person, was given the kingdom turned over to him by his parents. And he looked, all the women were going up regularly up to the mountains to have wine feasts. And these wine feasts would get out of hand. So oddly enough, if you really want to understand this, go on YouTube and see if you can find a play. Colleges seem to do it for some reason. It's supposed to be one of the most important plays ever done, but you can't find a decent movie on it anywhere. So all these women go up into the mountains, and even some of them will have references to Hermes. They'll have Hermes statues, which were very phallic symbols and things like that. And also these wine banquets they're attending are not just you getting drunk. You have to bring into focus all these disorientating things, because what happens that Pentheus is worried about what's going on in these wine banquets. Dionysius comes to him as sort of an evil god and tells him, well, maybe you should dress up as a woman and go witness these things yourself before you make a decree on them, before you rule whether these things are good or bad. So he dresses up as a woman, goes up to the mountain and participates as a woman in one of these female bacchanalias. What happens is everybody gets so drunk and out of shape that eventually Pentheus gets killed and eaten by his mother. Okay, so the references in this stuff is from the beginning. I mean, going all the way back to the beginning of time, is that the evil people are the Bacchae, which have deeply embedded in them this drug wine cult, and that Christianity is somehow a solution to this drug wine cult. Okay, so if you go into the book of John, especially the crucifixion, one of the contentions that actually ends up in Vatican II is, who are the Jews in this play? And the Jews take it personally that, well, you're making us all evil. But I would make the argument that really the Jews in the play is the Greek choir. And in Greek plays, the Greek choir really is the commentator, the collective commentator of what's going on, because you can't have, you don't have captions underneath in, early times.
Right.
Somebody's got to tell you what's going on. So what happens is the evil part of this, as sold to Vatican II, was the idea that the Jews are yelling, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him, and they take the brunt of all the blame of crucifying Christ. And then it ends up being in the Good Friday liturgy, where the Christians are actually praying for the fidelity of the Jews, and they take it as being a derogatory term. And so from there, they left that story in, but left the whole story of the Bacchae, that the evil of this whole thing wasn't specifically the Jews, because they were all Jews, was this idea of this drug cult that would get out of hand with these oddball exotic mixtures of chemicals that's very similar to your research in Mexico and things like that. You want to add anything there at this point? I'm trying to tie it together here.
Well, I mean, I suppose the next step, which you've already stated, was that what's her name ate her son unknowingly, out of control on this drug cult, and that's what we're seeing with Mexico. And then you factor in adrenochrome and whatnot, and then you have this, these essentially frenzied dance parties where they were cannibalizing their human sacrifices. And then Wasson and these people, they took only the mention of the mushrooms and left behind anything about the human sacrifice and cannibalism and all the rest of it, and then try to sell it as the long lost mushroom religion of Mexico. Well, you have to really be, well, a PR man, maybe the vice president of public relations for JP Morgan Bank, which is what Gordon Wasson was, to be able to finagle that type of analysis out of that, because anybody who goes, who dedicates months to flush out the primary citations, it's not what they're going to find. They're not going to find a soft, lovey-dovey, fluffy, new age version of this mushroom cult, and you have just acquired Professor Carl Ruck's book on Mithraeus and this whole cult, and I suspect you'll find a lot there. And in fact, Professor Ruck was my first #1 episode when I launched the show in 2008. I traveled to his house and interviewed the guy, and now I see him deeply embedded in all of this academic fraud and cover up of all of this stuff. He's the guy who invented the word entheogen, which I exposed in 2014 as as based on entirely fraudulent and ridiculous claims. But he could be professor emeritus now, but he was professor at Boston University. And he's been a central figure behind the promotion of all of this stuff for since the 70s. He published the article on creating the word entheogen back in 1979.
Right. And there's just this odd mixture of these things. One of the things that goes on, and even looking today with, like I said, looking at the Supreme Court, a lot of these people are invoking, that you can't bring up the Jewish blood libel. You can't bring up the fact that, the predominantly in the 1600s, the unknown world was, as we've been finding all over the place, was cannibalism. That was part of the savagery of the whole thing. But you end up with this denial. A lot of the papers that I looked at today were accusing Europe of being cannibals too, simply because in the Middle Ages, they would work on cadavers and things, trying to figure out what they were. And a lot of times they would take ingredients from a dead person and try to see if there was medicinal effect by it. What I think the thing that we found, and I think what you quoted your associate, one-time associate Whitehead, that the difference between cannibalism and doing these things is a ritualness to it. That one of the shocking things I found was looking at the Bacchae and its relationship to the Bible and the Gospel of John, was there's indications all over the place that the crucifixion was a ritual killing. We're told now that the Jews, they're not really the Jews, they often call the Jews, but the Pharisees went to Pilate and asked for permission to crucify Christ. And we think of that they had no permission at all to kill people. But if you actually do the research, you'll find out that in the prior century, they had killed 700-800 Pharisees and put them on the stake, which was today considered crucifixion. So they did have the authority to crucify somebody. What they didn't have the authority to do was to ritually kill somebody. And part of that ritual killing was the fact that you would put somebody up on the cross as a gesture of damning. Okay. Now,
damning the God,
damning the person, damning God. Well, that's again, I remember, if you remember, we were talking before on one of the past episodes that at one point he says, don't write on here, I am the King of the Jews, right? That he says, well, the whole idea of that is if you spelled it out, it spelled out the Hebrew tetragrammaton for God. That spelling was offensive to them. So the thing is, what precisely was the ritualness about this? Well, that goes back to Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 to 23. And if a man have committed a sin worthy of death, and he be to be put to death, and thou hang on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day, or he that is hanged is accursed of God, that thy land be not defiled, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for inheritance. And further in the New Testament, in Galatians, Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone that hangeth on a tree. And if you want, there's quotes in the Talmud, different places, that what they considered Christ at the time was a sorcerer. And so in order to rectify the situation, they, number one, had to hang him from a tree, which what they were hanging people from was a post. And it was after they had already died. It was basically an exhibition of evilness, and say, here's an evil person that we have killed. The very ritualness of this is that seldom, if ever, did they kill somebody as a result of the torture. The means of killing somebody in the Bible, if you look, usually is stoning or something like that. But when they crucified Christ, the means of crucifixion was the means of death. That is totally unique, and that was not something of Jewish tradition. That was more part of this curse. And the other part of the curse was that you had to get him down before nightfall.
And why was that?
If you didn't get him down before nightfall, then that damnation fell on you. Okay, so the part that Vatican II never addressed, and you have to look at the rare books by Jules Isaac and stuff to realize this stuff, it's all over the place. But what they left out was that there were parallel plays going on at the same time. One was the Feast of Purim throughout the years. The Feast of Purim was really based on the book of Esther, with Haman being the bad guy. And Haman was, as we talked about earlier today, was an Amalekite, or accused of being an Amalekite, which literally means blood liquor. And
back to cannibalism.
That, which I would say, yes, is a cannibalism of some sort, which that they found offensive. The Jews found that offensive, which, you know, they should find that offensive. So now you have to, well, why was Christ being called a blood liquor but the whole thing is based on this idea that you've got parallel plays going on in the future, which at almost the same, often in the same time, the Jews would be celebrating Purim at the same time the Christians were commemorating the crucifixion. And what happened over decades and decades of this, that the Christians came to believe that they were mocking the crucifixion of Christ, because even though I think a lot of the Jews didn't know that that's what they were doing, the Christians somehow had a deep suspicion that Haman was Christ. And I've got quotes in there you can find too, where even
and as you prove and argue in this book,
yes,
your hypothesis is that Haman is Christ,
right?
And you provide what, 13 exact coincidences?
13 coincidences, but also scholars throughout I think I have like 15 or so scholarly things say that Esther cannot be a 450 BC story. It's impossible.
Well, and the oldest copy of Esther comes from Josephus.
Right. And I challenge anybody to pick up Josephus and look at it, and you'll see the similarities. They're almost scary, and you read them, it makes you tremble, actually. But the thing is,
the Jews and Josephus was the Jewish historian for the Roman court, was essentially telling the story of Christ from the Jewish perspective. And people will argue, well, how come he doesn't record anything about it or barely mentions it? And if you accept that the book of Esther is his write-up of it, hidden in the story of Haman, then suddenly it takes on a whole new meaning and perspective.
And you can also make an argument too, was Josephus a crypto-Christian? At the time, the question I always, and I don't know if I mentioned it in the book or not, but the question I ask who was the witness to all these events? You know, you've got a very detailed story of the crucifixion. Who was there to witness these things and put them on paper? It almost have to be another Pharisee. You know, Christ didn't write it down. Somebody had somewhere you needed a vehicle if the story's not made up, and I don't believe it's made up because you've got corroborating evidence here. Who was the person sitting inside the trial to write it all down and say, here's what happened?
Usually the court, oh God, what's the name of the person?
Stenographer.
Yeah.
Well, Josephus was a Pharisee.
Right.
Now, whether he was there and the timeline doesn't fit, but somewhere you needed a vehicle from whatever happened inside that. And nobody seems to be arguing that the account is false or fake or anything like that. Somewhere you need a vehicle to transmit the story of the crucifixion out of the private into the public. And so I would say that vehicle very well could be Esther.
Chaz in the chat asks, no trees in the Near East, which I don't think is true. The forests of Lebanon were cut down. Wooden beam cross is out of place. Wondering if you've talked about this.
The wooden beam cross was indeed a Roman vehicle of killing. But Rome had no authority to kill somebody under those terms.
Well, but he's asking about it being in the Middle East. How did they get the wood to accomplish that, or where from?
I would say Lebanon. I mean, the thing is that it's well known that the Jews were using stakes and stuff. I mean, all they had to do is nail two stakes together. Which they, like I said, they had enough to crucify 800 people in the first century on stakes. So it can't be that
hard to come by some wood.
Yeah.
Or you put it on a boat and move it across the water.
Yeah. I don't see there's any doubt that that's the means of crucifixion, because the Roman Empire was doing it. There's records at but the Roman Empire did not have the authority. The only authority the Roman Empire had to crucify somebody was for sedition. It had to be a crime against the state. Pilate, as much as admits that, he said, I don't have no authority to kill him. He's at that point literally saying that there's no charge that the Roman Empire can place on him. So now you have the episode where Barabbas is, and I think there's more to that little episode where Barabbas is switched out for Christ. Bar is the Jewish equivalent of Von, or in Scottish, son of Bar Abbas. Abbas is father. So you've got somebody who's already sentenced to death, and Bar Abbas, which means son of the father, and you replace him with somebody else claiming to be son of the father.
Interesting.
So now what happens throughout the ages is that you get this thing called the blood libel. So Ariel Toaff, who was the son of the chief rabbi of Rome, one of the first books we talked about was Horowitz, the book on Purim, on rights. I'd have to get the book here, but the rights of Purim getting out of hand. And the thing was that they did heavy research into this as to what to degree that there was anything to this blood libel. And for people who don't know, the blood libel was that Jews were taking Christians, putting them up on stakes throughout history, which there are records in the Middle Ages that the practice was carried through, but stopped by the emperors as being, usually they were considered effigies, but there is some records that some of them were real Christians that were ritually murdered in effigy of this. So the point is this a real custom or not? I would say it is a real custom. It's probably, as anything like this, is over exaggerated. But again, how many ritual murders do you need in Mexico to say this is what they, how do you know?
Well, and then when you have the archaeological evidence that pops up and shows that they, in 2017 or 15 or something, they found one of the temples that buried under Mexico City that they estimate had 130,000 skulls, so that's quite a bit of sacrifice. And then just yesterday or day before in Mexico, they found let me see if I can pull it up here. They found what at first they thought it was a crime scene with 150 skulls, and then they discovered that here it is. I'll share it here for the audience. They discovered that let me see here. Is it gonna?
While you're looking at that, I'll finish up what I'm saying here. Is that at that point you find around the 2nd century that these cults split. Christianity goes one direction, the Dionysian version of Christianity goes another direction, and that's where you get this precedence of these mushroom cults. By the time you get to World War II, ostensibly that Vatican II was a permanent solution for there you go.
Yep, you can keep. Okay, well, this is the article here. Police find 150 skulls at crime scene in Mexico. It turns out the victims, mostly women, were ritually decapitated over 1,000 years ago. This is from April 28th, 2022. So it's 5 days old now. But again, this stuff is being discovered, and of course, for many years, anthropologists and historians claimed that the Christians, the Spaniards, made it all up as justification for getting rid of their old religion and stuff like this. But and part of it was justification for, so Queen Isabella of Spain decreed in what was it, 1503, that it was illegal to enslave anyone who was not a cannibal. And so, some of the ship captains and some of the mine owners and things like that did lie and make up stories about certain groups being cannibals, but it wasn't part of the practice of the Spanish. As far as the Spanish were concerned, you had to be a cannibal to be enslaved, period.
Right. And this goes into, if you go into World War II, and you're going to be honest about it, one of the main hatreds that Hitler had for the Jews was this idea of the blood libel. It's in Jewish books. It's all over the place. So you would thought by the time they would go to Vatican II that they would address this as a real issue. Well, they didn't address it as a real issue. And I think you have, and we found CIA documents kind of admitting to some of this stuff, that an oddball with the Seelisberg conference, which we discussed already, that they're basically shifting the focus of this all and pretty much blaming the Christians for everything bad that's happened to the Jews, leaving aside this whole thing of an honest dealing with what the blood libel was and how much of it was real and how much it was manufactured. And that right now, if again, you look at Chunk Yeager's video today commenting on the Supreme Court ruling, all these commentators, they're invoking this even to this day, they're invoking this kind of hatred. You look up cannibalism, and usually they'll blame the white people of Europe for trying to find medicinal remedies and confusing it with the idea of cannibalism, where cannibalism is specifically defined as a ritual murder. It's not, people, even to this day, whether you like it or not, people do use body parts and cadaver parts and figuring out medicines or, transplants or things like that. It's not, yep. You can't, it's mixing those two is disingenuous.
Agreed. What I want to do here is I want to show the audience what was, let me see if I can, I'll have to just open another window here. I want to show the audience what was published in 2018 regarding the Aztec or Mexica temples, and it's pretty astounding when you see this stuff. But let me just share this here. So feeding the gods, hundreds of skulls reveal massive scale of human sacrifice, and they also think they now know where another one of these old Aztec temples are that they haven't excavated yet. But you have stuff like this from what is this? I don't know if that's the Codex Machiavelliano or another one there. That may be that one. But all of these skulls packed in mud here that they found, that when the Spanish came along in 1521, they were just horrified by this stuff and they buried it all. Now, this
Now, I'm assuming that I've ended my. Is there any loose ends I've left here on my end of it?
I don't know. Just give me a second. Let me finish.
What I'd like to do is turn it around. Now I'd like to start, letting
okay.
you.
Well, have we fit? Well, we haven't gone into some of the other topics we need to, but
okay. So I'm gonna take off my hat now and kind of turn it more over to you, and I'll ask questions once in a while.
All right. Well, so what we have here is discovered under Mexico City is a 36 meter by 5 meter by 14 meter skull temple that they estimate had 130,000 skulls strung up, that we can see in the images here, how they believed that these temples were built based on how they were discovered. Now the wood poles that the skulls were on have since deteriorated, but so they go through and in this article they have all of these skulls here lined up, and they're showing this stuff, so people can no longer argue that the Spaniards made up that at least for the Mexica, that they were cannibals.
Now, let me ask
ahead.
a question of you. Now, in my little discourse that I've just given, I explained how the Persians would make a concoction of wormwood, which is a kind of adrenaline-based thing, wine, and perhaps your claim Ruck is basing his thing on that there's a mushroom base. Now, you're saying also
for the Hayoma, right?
Yeah, and you're saying also that there's a commonality between it. Can you explain that?
Well, so what it looks like with the Aztecs, or more properly today, the Mexica, where we get the term Mexico from, what they were doing, in my personal opinion, is it appears that they were drinking the blood of those that they slaughtered on the Sunstone and cannibalizing them for the adrenochrome. And then before they would cannibalize them, it doesn't appear that the mushrooms were part of the actual sacrifice at the top of the temple, but that they would have a feast after they did the sacrifices, but before they held this feast, they would consume the mushrooms and then cannibalize their victims. So potentially what you have, arguably speaking, is a potent cocktail of adrenochrome and the mushrooms being used, and then with the sacrifice being actual people.
So tell me if I've got this wrong. I think you said in one of our past discussions that the idea of the sacrifice was to terrorize the person being sacrificed, so that you would get a special blend of adrenaline.
Well, so I mean, if you can imagine being led up multiple, I don't remember how many hundreds of feet high these temples were, but they're being led up to the top of this temple, and they can see heads rolling down the temple stairs, and the temple is covered in blood as they're being led up to it. You'd probably be pretty terrorized, and then you're put on the sunstone and you're held down, and then they cut open your chest while you're still alive, and they rip out your heart while you're still alive, and then hold your heart up to the sun, and then potentially decapitate you and throw your body down the temple.
And the parallels that I see, and we've discussed this before, is that in a typical Christian communion service, you have right before communion, you have a hymn that's sung called the Agnus Dei, which is the Lamb of God. Well, if you go back to the Jewish side of the traditions of Passover, when the temple was there, you had this point in time where you had it literally turned into a slaughterhouse.
Right, where they would feed the local public lamb, and they were literally sacrificing, and you and I had discussed this yesterday, literally sacrificing the lamb in the Jewish temple and then feeding the public. So, one, you have animal lamb sacrifice, the other you have human sacrifice, and
one's real and one's metaphorical.
Right. And then Jesus becomes essentially, if I'm saying this correctly, the blood of the lamb.
Yeah. Well, yeah. The Agnus Dei is based, O Lamb of God, who takest away the sins of the earth, have mercy upon us. That is the words of the hymn.
And Jesus is shown holding the lamb in so many depictions.
Well, in a Catholic service, you also have the priest who holds. You just got done saying that you hold the head up. Well, in the
heart,
the heart up. Okay. In the Christian service, typically you would take the priest's host and elevate it in sort of a. I mean, you have what we're finding is a lot of parallels between with what we have talked about would be the changing of the thing from a reality to a metaphor, with the idea of expunging it of the reality, in a sense, so that you have one ritual killing that justifies and doesn't end with all the other ritual killings at the heart of Christianity.
Well, and would end the history of these ritual killings in purpose.
And so you found a lot of evidence throughout the world of ritual killings in different societies. Was this a universal thing, or?
Well, yeah, it appears that it was global, and it appears that for the last 50, 70 years, there's been an exerted effort to cover it up and pretend that the Spanish made it all up. But now, over the last 5, 7 years, with this archaeological evidence coming to light, they can't hide it anymore. They can't say that the Spaniards made it up anymore. So, with those 2 articles that I just showed on screen, that argument is dead now. So
what do you believe is the reason for the conversion of MK Ultra into convincing the society in the 50s and 60s that this was all just uniquely a drug cult?
Well, I think if they told anybody that it was a drug and human sacrifice cult, you've got Gordon Wasson, the vice president of public relations for JP Morgan Bank, heading MK Ultra Subproject 58. It wouldn't have been a good marketing thing to get kids hooked on. Oh yeah, let's go take that stuff that the Aztecs sacrificed, hundreds of thousands of people while on, or shortly after. And so they intentionally, and it looks like it went all the way back to Richard Evans Schultes, who is the founder of ethnobotany and another one who's considered the original Indiana Jones. But all of them are covering up the human sacrifice aspects and only discussing the drug aspects. So then you have this agenda. Well, if you're bringing back the drug aspect, if we go from Wicker Man to Burning Man and the psychedelics, et cetera, we're only one step away, really, with with the human sacrifice aspect. And then we see the cancel culture and these, freedom for everything and everything goes blah, 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 moral relativism, et cetera, that we've seen over the last 7, 8 years just explode everywhere, with the complete lack of critical thinking from people coming out of the universities and colleges, and nobody's taught how to think anymore. They're taught what to think. And then we see just this, like today with the whole Roe v. Wade thing. I mean, they're arguing to sacrifice children.
What do you think? To some degree, do you think this is a diversion tactic to get people obsessed with drugs? Or
yeah, but I think and I don't want to use a slippery slope fallacy, but I think the intended goal of all of this was to lead people back into this type of total debauchery, and you just have, so you've got the drug cult here, and then you've got the cannibalism here. It's one step away from falling into this, this heresy, this ancient satanic drug cult. And they, and the Mexicans, the Aztecs, Mexica, whatever you want to call them, they absolutely worshipped serpents. They had Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent. They had built temples where on the solstice, or was it the equinox, a serpent would traverse down the stairs of the temple and whatnot. So it was serpent worship. And and people can say, well, Satan worship with the serpent, that's a Christian thing. But when you look at the poisonous aspects of the serpent and of the drugs, and well, we can even connect, as I've shown you in my 2014 article in Theogen's What's in a Name, Aldous Huxley and Timothy Leary are sitting there bragging about recreating the fall, and and how the first controlled substances.
So they made the connections themselves.
And how the first controlled substances were the drugs. And so, and they're sitting there having a good old laugh about it and talking about how the Bible is the obstacle to this evolution. Well, it looks like they're trying to recreate.
Hold on, wait. The evolution. What is the evolution?
Well, that's what I was just about to say. Is I think their evolution is a devolution, that they are wanting to bring back, in a sense, this ancient drug culture. They want the debauchery, the lack of critical thinking, the hypersuggestibility, the schizophrenogens or psychotobimetics, to mimic psychosis. They want this stuff so that they can easily control people. But at the same time, I think it has a much more nefarious angle to it when you get in and look at these, colonial documents from the 15 and 1600s on, on these human sacrifice cannibalism cults.
Could we say that the drugs are believed to prod evolution?
So Terence McKenna, who is a big charlatan, came up with this stoned ape theory in his book, Food of the Gods, where he argued that the whole foundation of Darwinian evolution, which of course we know is a lot of BS as well, was that what he did was he basically took it and he inverted the Genesis story. And he said that, they ate the mushrooms on the savannas of Africa, and that kicked off human evolution. And, of course, this was rocketed around the world by Joe Rogan and others promoting this total nonsense, but, or pseudoscience, I should say. But Terence promoted the idea. He admits in one of his lectures, "Hey, Del, I'll talk to you in a bit, Del." He promotes this in one of his lectures, as a Trojan horse. And what is a Trojan horse? It's a military strategy by stealth. And so who is he using the military strategy against? The youth, apparently, correct? And so, they're arguing that it's the evolution when it's actually the devolution. They always invert this stuff. And we've gone on for years about how they literally invert everything to promote these ideas. But yeah, so anyway, there is this foundational claim made by the great charlatan Terence McKenna of using it for evolution.
One of the things that I found odd about this was that and you can look this up, the viewers can look up John B. Calhoun and his research on rats in the National Institute of Mental Health, that rats put through anxiety and stress. He thought it was overpopulation, but would release this spectrum of pathologies. And the spectrum included cannibalism, making gangs, gender dysphoria.
But and you and I had an hour or two talk about this yesterday, trying to figure out if it's really population density that causes it, and we think that it's incorrect. Did you come to that conclusion as well?
To me, it's, if you look at this dysphoria and you look at the different, if we're going to buy into the prevalence of cannibalism, which we have maps. I was looking for it while you were talking. I don't have it right at my, but there's
the which maps, the cannibalism maps?
Yeah.
I think I have it right here. Hold on just a second. Well, you go ahead and talk and I'll look for that.
Well, the idea is most of these places were not places you would consider overpopulated. So how does, this is, you're talking about the 1600s or so, or even older. How do you, if that is the cause, and we're going to believe this, follow the science, which is John B. Calhoun and National Institute of Mental Health, that what causes these pathologies, as he called them then, we are afraid to call them pathologies now because we're trying to normalize them. But he chalked it up to overpopulation. That prodded the spokesperson, Paul Ehrlich, who wrote the book, The Population Bomb, and basically tried to frighten the whole world in that we would only have 10 years. And I believe it was that the failure of the population bomb that eventually ended up being our modern global warming threats and things like that.
Did you know that one of the maps that you sent me is a Tartary map?
Yes.
Interesting.
I thought you'd be interested in it.
I just caught that. Sorry, go ahead. And I'll show it on screen here.
Oh, go ahead and show it.
All right. So there's a couple different ones here that you sent. Let me just share that window here. Now that I've got, here we go. All right. So here's one of the maps. We have what they considered, I guess they called Negro land in Africa here, where it was dense. And then Brazil, Guyana, oh geez, I just forgot the name, Mexico, etc., North America, Canada, northern, looks like Russia or Finland, something right there has it, China, India, all over Australia, New Zealand.
New Guinea is a big one.
Papua New Guinea. There, what's that little tiny island off of Australia? Also, it was big there. Here's the map of Tartaria that goes into. This one shows cannibalism as well.
I just sent it. I didn't even.
Oh, okay. So,
but on the top is the term anthropophagy.
Well, the anthropophagy would definitely be cannibalism.
Yeah, that's on the other map. So I mean, it was the modern commentators are trying to turn this all into a made up thing by white men to take over the world.
Right.
But the thing is, what you're looking at is most of these Catholic missionaries. I mean, this was a dangerous occupation. They go in, whether you believe it or not, they went into what they believed was places they were going to get eaten.
Yep, absolutely. So what? Yeah, so here's a close up of that. Oops, let me just zoom that back out. So, and there is a really good book on Africa that is still readily available called Negroes in Negroland that is about this specific area shown here. And I didn't share my mouse, unfortunately, but that area in Africa. But then you have all of these other areas around the world that are Haiti. Yeah, boy. There's a can of worms. And here's another map here that you showed. Cannibalism was practiced. So, we have all of this evidence of global cannibalism, and then we have this concerted effort to cover it up and make gullible people believe that the Spanish Christians who are supposed to be following Logos made it all up, that it was just missionary slander that they made up lies. Now, again, there is evidence that certainly some captains and mine owners, etc., did make up the lies, but the law, as far as the Spanish court was concerned and the royal court was concerned, was that if they weren't cannibals, you could not enslave them, period.
Didn't Christopher Columbus report back to the Spain?
So the day after Christopher Columbus reported back in 1493, they declared that all of those people would be free except for the cannibals, if I recall the citation correctly. So the very day that he got back to Spain, he reported it, and they declared all of the non-cannibal tribes would be free peoples.
I think it's important to know, especially, like I said, you look around the news today, to the degree that critical theory is based on the misrepresentation of this.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah.
And then, so, here's the thing, though. Here's the underlying story that nobody wants to discuss, except for me, apparently, is that all of the descendants of what would be slaves today would be based on Queen Elizabeth's or Isabella of Spain's edict in 1503. The vast majority, I should correct myself and say, are descendants of cannibals.
Okay.
So
that's volatile words.
Right. And it's volatile. And not only that, not only were they cannibals, but they owned slaves themselves that they cannibalized.
Wasn't there some reports on, and again, this is volatile territory. I don't know how well it sits with different people. And again, nobody was there. We didn't take pictures of it. But again, I think this falls under the honesty of telling the story, is that you can't just dismiss these things by saying, well, white people practice some odd medicinal herbs in the Middle Ages. Somewhere these accounts either are completely made up, or there has to be some truth to them somewhere.
Well, and that's what Professor Neil Whitehead did, whom I had on the show in 2008, before his untimely death. But he goes through and he analyzes everything. Oxford graduate, PhD in anthropology, worked at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he analyzed all the data, and he spent time out in Guyana and whatnot, and he said, yeah, there's no doubt that cannibalism was being practiced. Was there some being blown out of context? Yes. Was it real? Yes, absolutely. And so, so then what he would do is he would compare and say, okay, well, if you want to make up this, claim that the Spanish made it all up, well, we have the British and the Dutch, et cetera, who were working and aligning with these tribes, who also reported many of the same things. So then, if they were supporting these tribes as using it as a wedge against the Spanish, then why did they also have many of the same reports? And you read, I believe, Professor Whitehead's paper on that.
Yeah. Well, the people that seemingly were disconnected were reporting similar things.
Right. All over the place. So,
and it seems like an easy way to dispense with it is say that, blame the messenger.
Right. Well, yeah. Kill the messenger. Then we can just poo-poo it all. And those Christians, they made it all up, and never mind. Again, you and I have discussed many times on the shows. So have I and E. Michael Jones, the concept of Christian logos. Truth is God and Satan is the father of all lies, and making up slander and lies about this stuff. And not only that, lies that had to be presented to the king and queen of Spain in their reports and documentation probably wouldn't bode well if they were discovered to be making or fabricating these reports.
And I would actually go a little bit different direction. Does it sound like somebody who's presenting an honest overview or analysis of what's going on would make up of an entirely drug cult and then basically pervert a whole nation of teenagers that eventually would be adults, as they did in the 60s underneath MK Ultra. To what degree do you justify what's, not only that, but to what degree do you justify the recapitulation of what you're hiding here? You've created a drug cult. You created a kind of what Calhoun called a behavioral sink, which includes things like over promiscuity,
and
abortion.
As you know, and I've read them on the show many times, like, we get into these reports out of the Florentine Codex published by Father Sahuagin, or Friars Sahuagin, excuse me. And he's, there's 5 of these reports in the Florentine Codex where the people are totally debauched, and they are talking about that there. And yet Wasson is covering all of that up. And then, he creates a really weird spin story 23 years later in his The Wondrous Mushroom book, where he's, this gave the native Mexica the opportunity to tell the truth about how evil the bad regime, the old regime was. But his spin is just ridiculous. Let me read his spin here before I go into these. From these citations, we learn that the inebriating mushrooms had been abused under the old regime, as would be natural in any community freely using them. Okay, well, the hippie culture maybe that he created, by accepted standards of the Nuaha and other Mesoamericans, the mushrooms were imbued with sanctity and were to be ingested only where the glow of religious belief accompanied the act. Okay, well, that's completely ridiculous, because I've gone through every citation he's used, and it's all total BS. This claim is just absolutely ridiculous based on his own citations. And often he would just omit the paragraph before or after, or even the sentence before or after, and just get that one little line, and I've even had idiots on Facebook within the last couple of weeks argue these points with me. Oh, well, that's just because they're not taking these substances with due respect. It's like nonsense. In our 5 citations, the repellent context was fortunate for Sahuagin's informants. They could truthfully and gladly exoriate those who in former times had abused the mushrooms, and the friars would also approve of such exoriation, though they naturally were condemning all use of the mushrooms as mortal sin, trafficking with the devil. I mean, Wasson is just the never-ending quintessential liar and propagandist and BSer. The guy is just a unbelievable piece of trash.
Earlier today, at kind of your prodding, I typed in cannibalism in the Vikings.
Yeah.
And I was not even able to research it very well, because almost all the hits I got were either universities or papers written by, reputable institutions, quoting that, trying to push the case that the Europeans were really the cannibals.
And made up all of this stuff.
But the quotations, the citations had nothing to do with real citations. They were citing art works of art, or, Grimm's fairy tales or something like that.
Which is about witchcraft, by the way, Hansel and Gretel, etc. Well, let me
citing Bugs Bunny.
Right. Let me read, and many in the audience are going to be familiar with several of these, but these are from the Florentine Codex, Book 10, The People, by Friar Bernardo de Sahuagin. And these were originally written in Nahuatl by the Aztec or Mexica informants. For him, he had hired dozens of people and painters and artists and writers to help him with all of this, trying to document the entire culture for, reports that went back to the King of Spain, etc. It was published in 15 69. One of noble lineages, a follower of the exemplary life, a taker of the good example of others, a seeker, a follower of the exemplary life. The good one of noble lineage is a student, a teacher indoctrinated. He follows the exemplary life. He sets forth the exemplary life. The bad one of noble lineage is a scandalizer, a flatterer, a drinker, besotted, drunk. He goes about becoming crazed. He goes about eating deuterostramonium and mushrooms. He becomes vain, brazen. The lewd youth. The lewd youth is a madman. He goes about drinking crude wine, a drunkard, foolish, dejected, a drunk, a sot. He goes about eating mushrooms. He goes about demented. He is restless, dissolute, shameless, presumptuous, lewd, tattling, wicked, a vile brute, brazen. He is impudent. He consumes his inner substance. He is vain, proud, debauched, a pleasure seeker, a libertine, revolting, filthy, vicious, a keeper of mistresses, a talker. He lives in concubinage. He is given to pleasure. Okay, go to any dead show or pick any hippie you want, and I think you get the picture there. I'm going to read one more. I won't read my favorite, which is the harlot of the carnal woman. I've read that one like 50 times on the show about the itching buttocks and all of that. That's some pretty funny stuff too, but this is another short one here. Another noble woman is of nobility. She belongs to the order of rulers, comes from rulership, whether she is legitimate or a bastard child. The good noble woman is one who is bashful, ashamed of evil, who does things with timidity, who is embarrassed by evil. She works willingly, voluntarily. The bad noble woman is infamous, very audacious, stern, proud, very stupid, brazen, besotted, drunk. She goes about besotted. She goes about demented. She goes about eating mushrooms. So again, these are actually written by the Mazatec in the original language of Nahuatl, and they were translated to French, English, and Spanish. So
it's a commentary on their
own debauchery. And you just look at the counterculture that Wasson and Aldous Huxley and Timothy Leary and people like Terence McKenna et al. That they created, that I got caught into for years in the very beginning of my show before I came out and went, hit the brakes on.
The hypothesis is that they were focusing on young people, hoping that they could actually employ Darwin.
Well, when you look at these reports, I have no doubt that they read these old reports and said, let's just take out all of the cannibalism and human sacrifice, and we'll promote the drugs to the population for debauchery and iniquity. And then probably eventually that'll lead back to the cannibalism and the rest of it.
And eventually end up in 2022.
We're just, it's disgusting. So did we finish, did we touch on the theory of relativity and quantum physics and stuff like that in regards to?
We did that all last week.
We did.
I think I rounded that out last week.
All right. So
to put a capper on my thing was basically, a lot of what I did has to do with the Shroud of Turin. And we discussed that a little bit once a long time ago. That might be another episode. But basically, what we discussed earlier today and yesterday was to the degree that there's evidence. Scholars have, certain scholars have looked at the Shroud of Turin as being a forensic evidence, and then saying, what's the likelihood of this happening accidentally or whatever?
Well, yeah, and you had said even NASA investigated it and couldn't
the Air Force,
it.
the U.S. Air Force people that had connections with NASA. But the thing is what's underneath there is, again, it's one of these things a lot of people dismiss, but somewhere there was a ritual murder.
Yeah,
and the evidence is there, and some of it people say kind of poo-poo it, but there's a lot of forensic evidence, I think, that a sane person would say you can't just dismiss as being white bigotry or something like that. And it seems to me one of the motivating factors today is critical race theory, and one at the centerpiece is something everybody's afraid to bring up, and it came up in Vatican II. It came up with the drug culture is it seems like underneath was a concerted effort to hide the truth and cover it up with a drug culture.
Yeah. So thanks to Steve and Dell and Jeffrey, who all sent donations, and also thanks to Matthew and Ka Painter, whom I already mentioned earlier, all for supporting the show during this episode. Are there any questions from the audience as we wrap up this series? Anybody? And do you have anything else you want to add, Steve?
I think that puts a pretty good capper on my whole book, Authenticating Christianity, because one of the things I was trying to do in that book is take real life incidents of recorded history and put them into a context that affirmed what was going on. So many people think of Christianity as this odd religion that you're worshiping this image of this God in the sky or something like that. And I think there's a virtue in trying to make these things real and having people confront the reality of the whole thing. When you go to church and you have communion or something like that, even myself, as we're talking these things out, I'm faced with the reality even more of what's going on.
So we got a good question from Joe in the chat. And so he says he's young and basically trying to figure out if reality is completely relative and if there is no moral consistency. And you and I have covered this in depth, and I've covered it on the show for years and years. Your book, which I recommend to Joe, is called Authenticating Christianity. It's 229 pages, I think. And he goes through all of those arguments. And so what you're questioning, Joe, is what is Neoplatonism and Gnosticism and Manichaeanism and Catharism, etc., that is bled into Christianity and into all of these New Age.
Well, the principal question in all this is reality real, or is it a figment of your imagination?
Right.
And the beginning of that has to do is there certitude? Can I have certitude in something? And the idea is if I can prove certitude in one thing, then there has to be certitude in two things, and you built up the scale. Well, in the old way that the church used to teach it before Vatican II, is you began with the principle of non-contradiction. Something cannot both be and not be at the same time. Something can't be contrary to itself. That becomes a first principle, and you can be certain of that. It's impossible to be both sides of that equation. What happens with Manichaeism and into Gnosticism is really a hatred for reality. They can't resolve those things, so they try to do away with it. Reality becomes a creation of a fallen God instead of in science they would say a first principle, but in Christianity we would say a God. But in Gnosticism, it's always the reality was created as a mistake. It becomes an argument over good and evil, and it's unresolvable. And it's a long path. But the thing is, you can have, again, once you acquire a certain basis in certitude, which I've just given you, you can now go back and search these things. There's other books than myself too that you can go back and start building up a structure of certainty. Rather than jump right into the brink of the whole thing, build up. One of the things that doesn't get published enough these days is the concept of a theodicy. And the theodicy is a type of Christian book where they really didn't try to sell you on Christianity per se. What they tried to show you was the problems with the way people look at reality, and then they show how Christianity answers those things. That's always a good approach to get your feet on firm ground, realizing that all these Gnostic paths are purposely made contradictory, and they're at the end of the day, they're really just the philosophical version of taking drugs.
Yep. And some guy Bursey in the chat is you had a trip you still haven't forgave yourself for, I bet, and mushrooms are from the earth. And, I'm almost finished writing a 70-page paper or book going through every ancient citation, covering the entire history of where the whole mushroom religion comes out of. And, people like this, they can't, they have to attack the presenter. They can't think logically and critically and say, wow, maybe there's something here that I need to look at. And actually, I wrote this paper because of people like this Bursey guy who would constantly say, well, mushrooms are older than the CIA, so therefore they're the true origins of religion, and they're hold on, and they're from the earth. So that therefore that must make them good. Never mind all of these historical reports talk about them being for Satanism from Europe, from the Americas, all over the world, talk about them causing stupidity. Not only that, if this guy had studied my earlier work from 8 years ago, 8 years ago now, in my article in Theogens, What's in a Name, I showed how they cause hypersuggestibility, which makes people more easily controlled. So you get these arguments from people like this who want to attack me and make it about, oh, well, I must have had something, blah, 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 to make it not about the research, and it's just, no, it's the whole thing was provided, it was manufactured by the CIA under MK Ultra subproject 58. You wouldn't even know about the mushrooms unless it was for MK Ultra subproject 58. He's like, adios, knuckle draggers. I did not attack you. Grow up. Yeah, you did, dude. When you make it about me and not about the research and facts, that is attacking me. Are there, whatever. Anyway, see you later, dude. Bye-bye.
Let me ask him one question. Maybe he's not gone yet. How do you forgive yourself in a meaningful way? Can a computer fix itself?
Well, he just gets high and contemplates his navel, I guess. Pillow sits.
Well, I would ask anybody, that's a good thing to ponder. How do you forgive yourself?
Yeah, good, great question. But, obviously, when he makes it about me and me not having a trip, I've forgiven myself or something, he's making all of this years of research on this subject about me having some issue, not about actually looking at the research, and which he obviously hasn't done. He's too busy being high and going, oh, this is the true origins of religion. And this is what, people
the
like
route
this
of
do.
Gnosticism, the route of denial, the route of forgiving yourself is solipsism.
Yeah.
Eventually you do away with enough stuff, you'll eventually left with yourself, and that's it.
Yeah.
So
monopsychism.
Ultimately, all you end up with is you, and who's left to forgive you but you.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, you don't follow yourself to be forgiven, Tony just said. Great point, Tony. Let's see, that you were talking about, what you are speaking about really supports a lot of what I've also been facing from trolls since 2006. Yeah, Brian, 14 years doing this show, and you always get those people that can't focus on the actual research. They won't even look. They've never even investigated. It's got to be about you and some trip, or you've never tried them, or, or they're older than the CIA, or they came from the earth, therefore they're good, as if there aren't plenty of poisons and toxins at all that come from nature that destroy lives. I mean, heroin, it comes from nature. Opium, it's from nature. So is what they make,
at some point,
uranium,
most drugs are from nature. A lot of them are from rattlesnake poison.
There you go.
It's,
hey, rattlesnakes are from nature. That must be good, right, dude? Hey, man, let's go smoke some 5-MeO DMT frog venom, man.
In fact, I would say and tell me if I'm wrong, but the whole idea of most psychedelics and stuff is that it's or most drugs is that they're poison at some point, and what you're experiencing is a poisonous effect.
Absolutely. I don't prefer anymore to use the term psychedelics, although I still do, but I like to use my own word suggestogens because they cause hypersuggestibility.
Mhm.
And the word psychedelic was manufactured by Humphrey Osmond, who we know for a fact was MK Ultra subproject 111. He worked directly with Aldous Huxley, who is the architect of MK Ultra, et cetera. So they created that word and the word entheogen to market these substances to people like this guy Bursey, who is impervious to facts and history.
And what I would say flat out is is this the action of an honest person? Is it honest people make mistakes, honest people rear back a little bit once in a while. This idea of this complacent we're gurus and we know everything and just follow us and we'll take care of you. The whole idea is duplicitous because underneath they have clear. We've exposed the fact that there was other schemes underneath. That just isn't the action of somebody who's an honest person, as far as I'm concerned.
Yep, I agree. Well, we are an hour and a half in. I think that's a good place to wrap it up.
I'm finished.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Hit the like and subscribe. Thanks to all of you who supported the show tonight. You can also send donations from logosmedia.com, LOGOS media.com. And have a great night, everybody. And we will see you soon. Maybe we'll go into more depth on some of the discoveries soon. Maybe I'll bring Chris back and he can interview me on the mushroom article. But anyway, we shall see you soon and be back soon. Have a great night, everyone. And